You will marry her, Kelby, or you will watch this house sold to strangers before Michaelmas." The words hung in the cold morning light of the study, and Kelby, Duke of Nethercombe, did not turn from the window at once. He let his aunt's declaration settle upon the room the way frost set upon the park below, quite entirely changing the look of everything it touched. Beyond the glass, the long avenue of limes stood bare and black against a pewter sky, and past them lay the tenant cottages, the mill, the 400 souls whose winter bread depended upon a name his late father had all but ruined at the card tables of London. "I did not know," he said at length, "that you had grown so fond of arranging my life, Lady Marchburn." "I have grown fond of nothing," his aunt returned. She sat very straight in the chair by the fire, her gloved hands folded upon the head of her cane, her face the colour and hardness of old ivory. "Fondness is a luxury for people with money. You have debts, nephew, that would stagger a nation, and I have found you the only cure society will permit a man of your rank. A fortune married clean into your title. The girl comes with £60,000. You will take her and smile at the wedding, and no one need ever know that the great Duke of Nethercombe was 3 seasons from the poorhouse." Kelby turned then. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulder, with dark hair going grey at the temple though he had not yet reached 40, and a face that men in ballrooms had learned to read as a warning. There was a coldness to him that he had not been born with. It had been given to him one grief at a time. A mother dead when he was a boy, a father who had drunk and gambled until the very tenants flinched at the family carriage, and 7 years past, a betrothal broken in the most public manner London could devise. When the woman he had loved had chosen a richer man and let all the world watch her do it, he had learned from that. He had learned that a heart carried openly was a purse left open on the street, and he had closed his and thrown away the key, and he had not been sorry. "And who is this fortune I am to smile at?" His aunt's mouth thinned. "Her name is Fairholt. Pernil Fairholt. Her grandfather was in trade, coal and iron in the north, and the family has scrubbed at respectability for 2 generations without ever quite reaching it. The girl herself is nobody. Plain, they say, and shy, and raised half in a counting house. But the money is real and unencumbered, and her people are so desperate to gild themselves with a coronet that they will pay for the privilege twice over." She lifted her cane and set its point upon the carpet as though closing an account. "You need not love her, Kelby. God forbid. You need only wed her, take the settlement, and keep her out of the way. A marriage for appearances. Nothing more is asked. Nothing more is asked." The phrase had a bitter familiarity to it. All his life something had been asked of him, and always the same thing: to hold the name up, to keep the roof on, to be the wall against which the whole ramshackle edifice of Nethercombe leaned. He crossed to the great desk where the ledgers lay stacked like tombstones, and opened the topmost, and understood that his aunt, for all her cruelty, was not lying. There was no other road. He could sell the London house, and the pictures, and the horses, and still the water would rise. Only the girl's £60,000 stood between his people and the winter. "Have I met her?" he asked. "You have not. She is here." He looked up sharply. "In the house," his aunt went on, with the faint satisfaction of a woman who has arranged matters past the point of retreat. "I brought her down from town with her aunt, a Mrs. Denmark, and her cousin, Miss Augusta Denmark, who is by far the handsomer of the two and never lets the poor creature forget it. They are at breakfast. I thought it best that you look at what you are buying before the settlements are signed." She rose, slow and imperious, and moved toward the door. "Do try, Kelby, not to freeze the girl to death. She is timid enough to faint at a hard word, and I would not have her cry off before her people have signed. £60,000 does not come twice to a house like this one." She went out, and the door closed, and Kelby stood alone with the ledgers and the frost and the ruin of his father's making, and for a long moment he did not move at all. Then he went down to look at the woman he had agreed, in the space of a quarter hour, to marry. He heard them before he saw them, or rather he heard one of them, bright, carrying, confident voice pitched to fill a room, coming from the small breakfast parlour at the foot of the stairs. He paused in the corridor, in the shadow beyond the doorway, with the unhurried stillness of a man accustomed to arriving unannounced in his own house, and he watched. The parlour was warm with fire and morning sun. At the table sat 3 women. One, stout and overdressed in puce, was plainly the aunt, Mrs. Denmark, buttering toast with the grim concentration of a woman who has clawed her way up the world one social rung at a time. Beside her, in a gown of primrose muslin that must have cost more than a labourer earned in a 12-month, sat a young lady of undeniable prettiness, glossy dark ringlets, a rosebud mouth, a chin held at the exact angle that says a girl has been told she is beautiful since the cradle and has believed every word of it. This, then, was Miss Augusta Denmark, and it was her voice he had heard, and she was laughing as she spoke, and at the far end of the table, half turned toward the window, sat a third. She was not looking at the others. She had a cup of tea before her, untouched, her hands folded in her lap. And she was watching the frost on the glass with a stillness that was not shyness. He saw that at once, though he could not have said how, but the deep, contained quiet of a person who has learned that silence less than speech. She wore grey, a plain, unadorned grey, without so much as a ribbon to soften it, and there was nothing in her dress or her posture that asked to be admired. She was, he supposed, what his aunt had called her, plain, overlooked. A creature raised in the shadow of prettier, louder women and taught to take up as little of the world as she could, and yet Kelby found that he did not look away. For I told Mama, Augusta was saying, that it was greatest joke in nature to think of our Pernille as a duchess. A duchess. Why, she can enter a room without treading on her own hem, and she has not two words to rub together at a dinner. They will say the Duke has married a governess. They will say he has married his housekeeper. She laughed, a pretty, silvery, practiced sound. But then it is not to be a real marriage, is it? So I suppose it hardly signifies what they say. He is only after the money, everyone knows that, and she is only to be got out of the way. Poor Pernille. To be married and unwanted in the same breath. I could almost pity you, cousin, if you were not so provokingly calm about it. The stout made a sound that might have been reproof and might have been agreement. It was difficult to tell through the toast. And Kelby, in the shadow of the doorway, felt something tighten in his chest that he did not welcome and could not name, for he had come down that staircase intending to feel nothing, and here on the very threshold, feeling had ambushed him. He waited for the grey woman to weep. His aunt had promised him a creature who fainted at a hard word, and here were hard words in plenty, and he braced himself for the tears, the trembling lip, the small collapse that would confirm everything he had been told and let him climb the stairs again with his cold heart intact. Pernille Fairholt turned from the window. "You mistake me, Augusta," she said. Her voice was low and quite steady, with no tremble in it at all. "I am not calm because I do not feel it. I am calm because I have heard it all before and from kinder mouths than yours, and I have learned that a thing said cruelly is not made truer by the cruelty. You are quite right that the Duke wants only the money. I have never supposed otherwise. But I would rather go into a cold house with my eyes open than into a warm one that lied to me, and there is no dishonesty in a bargain that both sides understand." She lifted her untouched cup at last and drank from it, unhurried. "I shall try not to tread on my hem. And if I do, I shall pick it up again and go on. It is a thing I have had a great deal of practice at." The parlour was silent. Augusta's pretty mouth had opened and then closed. The stout aunt's knife had stopped upon the toast. And Kelby, who had expected tears and been given instead a thing far more disarming, dignity, plain and unadorned as her grey gown, worn without apology, discovered that he had stepped forward into the light of the doorway without deciding to. 3 heads turned. Mrs. Denmark came up from her chair in a flurry of puce and curtsies. Augusta's face rearranged itself in an instant from malice to sweetness, the ringlets tilting, the lashes lowering, a blush summoned to order across her cheek. "Your Grace," she breathed, and the whole of her seemed to open toward him like a flower toward the sun. "What an honor, what a very great honor, to have you among us. I hope we do not intrude upon your morning. Mamma was only just saying how magnificently the park is kept." But Kelby was not looking at Augusta Denmark, though she had arranged herself to be looked at with the practiced skill of a girl who had never once failed to draw the gaze of a man of rank. He was looking past her down the length of the table at the woman in grey who had not risen, who did not blush, who met his eyes across the ruin of the breakfast things with a steady, level, wholly unfrightened regard. "Miss Fairholt," he said, "Your Grace." She inclined her head. She did not simper, and she did not lower her lashes to make him feel the size of his own consequence. She only looked at him as though she were taking his measure precisely as he was taking hers, and finding, perhaps, that a duke was a man like any other, no larger for his coronet and no smaller for his debts. "You will forgive me," he said, and he heard the coolness in his own voice and was for once faintly ashamed of it, "for coming upon you unannounced. It is a habit of the house. I find one learns more of a place by arriving quietly than by being announced." "I imagine one does," she said, "though I am not sure those so arrived upon would agree the learning is fairly got." Behind her cousin, Augusta gave a small, scandalized laugh, as though the grey mouse had committed a solecism that would surely undo them all. Mrs. Denmark went a shade of puce deeper than her gown. But Kelby, who had not been answered in that manner by anyone save his aunt in a decade, who was flattered and feared and flinched from but almost never simply met, felt the corner of his hard mouth move in a way it had nearly forgotten how to do. He agreed, "I dare say not." He came into the room. He did not sit. He stood at the corner of the table, one hand resting upon its edge, and looked at the three of them, the fawning aunt, the dazzling cousin arranging her charms upon the air like a shop displaying its silks, and the plain woman in grey who wanted nothing from him and had told her own cousin, not 2 minutes past, that she would rather go into a cold house with her eyes open than a warm one built on a lie. He thought of the ledgers, and the 400 souls whose winter turned upon £60,000 and a smile at a wedding. And he thought that the discomfort he did not understand, that he had come down these stairs to inspect a bargain and had found instead a person, a far more dangerous thing than any debt. "I am told," he said, addressing himself to Pernille and to no one else, though Augusta's whole frame leaned toward him, "that we are to be married." "So I am told also," said Pernille Fairholt. "Though this is the first I have seen of my intended, and I had begun to wonder whether he existed at all, or whether I was to be wed to a coronet, upon a cushion and set in a corner, to be got out of the way." "Pernille," hissed Mrs. Denmark. "It is only the truth, aunt," said Pernille without heat. "His Grace and I are to be honest with one another, or we are to be nothing. We do not love each other. We do not know each other. He wants my grandfather's money, and I want—" She paused, and for the first time something crossed her steady face, quickly mastered but not quite hidden, a shadow of wariness far older than her years. "I want a door of my own to close," she finished quietly, "and a name that no one can take from me, and to be, for once in my life, somewhere I am not a burden or a joke. It is not much to buy with £60,000, but it is what I am buying, and I would rather he knew it." The fire cracked in the grate, and Kelby, Duke of Nethercombe, who had closed his heart 7 years before and thrown away the key, stood very still and understood, with the singing certainty of a man who feels the ground shift beneath a lifetime's habit, that this marriage of appearances was not going to remain, for very long, a thing of appearances only, and that of all the perils his ruined house had ever faced, this quiet, grey, unflinching woman who asked nothing of him might yet prove the one he was least prepared to withstand. "Then you shall have it," he heard himself say, before he had weighed the words, the door, the name, all of it. "I give you my word, Miss Fairholt, and my word, whatever else the world says of me, has never once been for sale." She looked at him a long moment, and then, slowly, as though it surprised her as much as it surprised him, Pernille Fairholt smiled, a small, unpracticed smile, worth 10 of her cousins, and Kelby felt the key he had thrown away turn, very faintly, somewhere he had thought forever locked. It was Augusta who broke the spell, as Augusta would always break it. "How very generous of your Grace," she said, and though the words were sweet, the smile beneath them was not, and Kelby saw for the briefest instant the true face under the pretty one. The calculation of a girl who had come into this house expecting to leave it a duchess herself, and who did not yet believe she had lost. "Only I do hope, for dear Pernille's sake, that the world will be as kind as you are. You know how people talk, and there is to be the ball." "The ball," Kelby repeated. "Why, has no one told you?" Augusta's eyes widened in a show of innocent dismay that deceived no one and was not meant to. "Lady Marchburn means to give the grandest ball Nethercombe has seen in 20 years, to present the new Duchess to the county before the wedding. Every family of consequence for 40 miles is to come." She turned her ringlets prettily toward her cousin. "All of them, dearest, come to look at you. I only hope you shall not find it too great a strain. There will be so very many eyes." And there it was, laid upon the table between the toast and the cooling tea, gentle as a knife wrapped in silk. Kelby understood it perfectly. His aunt would gather the whole of society into one gilded room and set this counting-house-bred woman at the center of it. Not to honor her, but to have the marriage witnessed and sealed beyond retreat before the ink was dry, and every sneering matron and idle daughter in 3 counties would come to watch the Duke of Nethercombe parade the fortune he had been reduced to marrying. It would not be a presentation. It would be a spectacle, and Pernille Fairholt would have to walk the length of it under the eyes of people who had decided, before ever they saw her, exactly how far beneath them she stood. He looked at her. She had not flinched at the word, but she had gone very still again, the stillness of the window and the frost, and he thought he understood now what that stillness cost her, and what it hid. "You will not walk into that room alone," he said. It came out of him low and hard, more oath than comfort, and it startled him as much as the promise before it had. "Whatever else this marriage is, or is not, Miss Fairholt, on that night you will have my arm. Let them look." Mrs. Denmark's knife trembled against her plate. Augusta's smile faltered for the first time and did not entirely recover. But Pernille only held his gaze across the wreck of the breakfast, and there was in her grey eyes a spark of astonishment, quickly banked, and beneath it something that looked almost like hope, and frightened him more than any ledger ever had. "Then let them," she said quietly. "And Kelby?" Duke of Nethercombe turned and left the parlour before he could say a third thing he had not weighed, and climbed the cold stairs to his study, and stood a long while at the frosted window looking out at the bare black limes. A man who had come down that morning to buy a silence and found, instead, a voice, and who knew with a dread he could not name and would not yet confess, that the ball his aunt was planning to save his fortune might be the night he lost the last careful thing he had left to lose. The carriage that carried his new Duchess into the courtyard of Nethercombe was not the one Kelby had sent for her. His own crested chaise, with its matched greys and its liveried outriders, had gone down to Fairholt 3 days past with instructions that she be brought north in a manner befitting the name she now bore. What rolled beneath the gatehouse at dusk was a hired thing, mud to the axles, one lamp guttering, its hired man slouched and sullen at the reins. Kelby watched it come from the tall window of the long gallery, and something in him hardened before he had decided to let it. He knew the meaning of it at once, for he had learned early to rid the small cruelties of his own class. His steward had told him the sum settled upon the Fairholts to close the business of the marriage, a sum generous enough to have hired every post-chaise between London and the border. That they had spent none of it upon the girl herself, that they had turned his own carriage back and packed her off in whatever conveyance cost them least, told him precisely how much the family valued the daughter they had sold. She had come to him the way a debt is paid, quickly and without ceremony, and with the wish that she be got off the ledger and thought of no more. The bargain had been theirs to make and his to accept, and he had accepted it with his eyes open. A Duke of 35 who has buried both parents and been jilted once, publicly, by a woman who wanted the coronet and not the man beneath it, learns to prefer arrangements to affections. Arrangements did not lie. A marriage struck for appearances asked nothing of the heart and therefore could not wound it. He had told himself this in the study of his solicitor while the settlement was drawn, and he had believed it, and he intended to go on believing it. The Fairholt girl would wear his name, sit at the foot of his table, be presented to the county at the ball his aunt had already begun to plan, and give the world the picture of a duchess. He asked no more of her than that. He had resolved to ask no more of anyone, ever again. Still he did not send a servant down. He went himself, which he had not meant to do, and stood on the broad steps beneath the lamps while the hired man let down the step and did not trouble to hand her out. She descended alone. That was the first thing he marked. She set her own gloved hand to the cold iron rail and came down without waiting for the arm that was not offered, and she did it without any flourish of injured pride, as though she had descended from a great many such carriages and expected nothing better from this one. She was smaller than he had pictured, and plainer dressed than any bride of his house had been in 3 generations, a travelling gown of dove grey stuff, good once and turned twice, mended at one cuff with stitches so fine he only saw them because the lamp caught them. No jewels, no maid. A single small trunk that a footman lifted as though it weighed nothing, 'cause it very nearly did. "Your Grace," she said and curtsied, not too low, exactly as low as was correct, and no lower, so that the courtesy was a statement and not a plea. "Miss Fairholt," he caught himself. "Forgive me." "Your Grace, the habit of a stranger's name will take a day or two to leave me." Something moved at the corner of her mouth that was not quite a smile. "It will take longer than that to arrive at me, sir. I have answered to Miss Fairholt for 24 years. I should not like you to feel you must apologize each time it slips." He had expected tears, or trembling, or the brittle gaiety of a girl determined to charm the man who had bought her. He had braced for flattery above all, for the practiced sweetness of a woman who knows her whole future hangs upon pleasing the person before her, and lays it on accordingly. He had endured a great deal of that in his life, and had grown so weary of it that he could taste the falseness before the first sentence was finished. What she gave him instead was the plain truth, offered without art, and it landed in the cold evening air and simply stood there, unanswerable. "You are tired," he said, because he did not know what else to do with it. "I am," she agreed, and did not elaborate that either. She did not tell him how many hours she had sat in the dark with one lamp, or how the springs had been broken, or how the hired man had stopped twice at inns for his own comfort and none for hers. He knew all of it, looking at her, and he knew she would not use a word of it to soften him. She had decided, somewhere on that long cold road, that she would enter his house owing him nothing and asking him for nothing, and she meant to keep to it. He led her in himself. That too he had not meant to do. The great hall of Nethercombe was built to make men feel small, and it had been doing so successfully for 200 years. The vaulted stone, the ranked portraits of dukes who had all worn the same guarded face he wore now, the fire that was too far off in its cavern of a hearth to warm anything but itself. Brides had wept in this hall. His mother, they said, had looked up at it on her wedding day, understood exactly the bargain she had made, and never smiled in it again. He watched Pernille Fairholt's eyes travel up the stone to the dark rafters, and he waited for the flinch or the calculation, the swift greedy sum of what all this was worth, which was the look he had seen on the last woman he had brought beneath this roof with hope in his chest. It did not come. She looked at the hall the way one looks at a mountain, or the sea, with a kind of grave respect for a thing much older and larger than herself, and no wish at all to possess it. "It is a cold house," she said at last, quite gently, as if she were sorry for it rather than daunted by it. "Someone has been unhappy here a long while, I think." He said nothing. He could not, for a moment. No one had ever said such a thing to him in his own hall, and the reason no one had was that no one had ever looked past the gold of it to see the truth she had named in a breath. They were not to be left in peace with it. His aunt came down upon them in a rustle of silk and consequence, Lady Marchburn, his father's sister, who had ruled the social affairs of Nethercombe since he was a boy and considered the ruling of them her freehold. She had opposed this marriage from the hour it was proposed, not because it was hollow, but because it was beneath them. A Fairholt, she had said more than once, was scarcely a family at all, a scramble of mortgaged acres and unpaid tradesmen. And to hang the name of Nethercombe upon such a peg was a thing the county would not soon forgive. She came now to inspect what her nephew's folly had brought home, and her eyes went over Pernille from the mended cuff to the plain grey hem with the leisurely thoroughness of a woman pricing a horse she has already decided not to buy. "So this is the bride," said Lady Marchburn, to the air somewhat above Pernille's head. "My dear, you must be quite worn to the bone. What a very practical little gown. One admires economy so in these times. Kelby, she cannot be seen by anyone in this state. You understand that the whole county means to call within the fortnight, and the ball is but 3 weeks off. We shall have a great deal to do." She said we as though Pernille were not a person who might do things, but a project upon which things must be done. Kelby felt the old familiar tightening behind his ribs, the wish to be anywhere that was not a room full of his family's manners. He had heard Lady Marchburn speak so to 100 lesser creatures, and had never once troubled to stop her, for it cost him nothing, and to stop her cost effort. He waited, out of a habit he was not proud of, for the girl to shrink. "You are very kind to think of it, madam," said Pernille. Her voice was perfectly even. "Though I hope the county will forgive me my gown. It has come a long way and served me faithfully, and I find I cannot be ashamed of anything that has done its work so well." It was said so mildly that it took Lady Marchburn a full second to understand she had been answered, and answered in a way that left nothing for her to seize, for there was no impertinence in it, No heat, nothing but a quiet refusal to be made small. Kelby watched his aunt's mouth open and find no purchase and close again. He had seen men of great cleverness fail to manage that particular feat, the turning aside of Lady Marchburn's cruelty without giving her the wound she fed upon. This girl in her mended grey had done it standing in a cold hall after 3 days on a broken road, and she had done it without appearing to have done anything at all. Well, said Lady Marchburn, recovering thinner now about the lips, we shall see how the gown does at the ball. The county has a long memory, child, and it does not extend its charity to those who cannot be bothered to earn it. You would do well to spend less of your breath on the merits of your wardrobe and more upon learning what will be expected of you. There is a great deal you do not know. She let that hang, so that it might be understood to mean a great deal about everything. Then she gathered her silks and swept out, well pleased in the manner of one who has fired the first shot of a campaign and intends the war to be long. The hall was quieter for her going. Pernille stood where she had stood, her hands folded, her chin level, and only now, with the aunt gone and no one left to hold the line against, did Kelby see the smallest slackening in her, the faint tremor she had kept out of her voice sitting instead in the fingers she pressed flat to still it. She had been afraid the whole while. She had simply refused to let the fear govern her. That he understood suddenly, and against every intention he had brought down these stairs, was not the same thing as flattery, nor the same thing as pride. It was courage of a homely and unornamented kind, and he had spent so long in rooms full of the glittering and the false that he had nearly forgotten what it looked like when it was real. My aunt, he said, has a great deal of practice at being unpleasant, and no one to check her. You need not answer her at all, if you would rather not. I would rather answer her honestly than be silent and have her think me either frightened or agreeing, said Pernille. She looked at him then, directly in a way that few people permitted themselves. Most met his eye and slid away from it, disquieted by the coldness they expected to find. She did not slide away. May I say a thing plainly, your grace, and have you not take it ill? You may say a thing plainly, he answered. I begin to think you can say it no other way. I know why I am here, she said. I know what my family were paid, and I know what I was paid for. I am to be looked at, and not much more, a duchess for the portrait, so the world may see the Duke of Nethercombe has married and think no further on it. I do not complain of the bargain. It has saved my father from the sponging house and my younger sisters from something worse, and for that I would have signed a harder paper than the one I signed. But I should like us to be honest with one another under this one roof, if nowhere else, because I do not think I can bear 3 weeks of pretending under your aunt's eye if I must also pretend to you. You bought a wife for appearances. I mean to be a very good one. Only do not ask me to smile as though I did not know what I am. He was a man who had built his whole life upon not being reached, and he stood in his own cold hall and felt the wall of it give, silently, somewhere he could not see to shore up. She had named the bargain aloud. The very bargain he had told himself protected him, and in naming it so cleanly she had done the one thing he had believed impossible, which was to make the hollowness of it feel like a wound after all. No, he said, and his voice was rougher than he wished. I will not ask you to smile. Thank you, she said simply, and something eased in her, and she looked once more up at the dark and mournful hall as though it were a fellow sufferer. I will try to warm it a little, if you will let me. Cold houses can be mended. I have lived in all my life. He might have let her go up then. It would have been the natural close of the evening, and the safer one. Instead, he heard himself say, You have not eaten, and knew by the way she stilled that he was right, that she had come 3 days on a broken road, and been handed no more than what an inn's kitchen spared for a passenger travelling cheap. I did not like to ask, she said. One learns not to, in a house that has settled a large sum to be rid of one. You are not in that house any longer. The words came out of him before he had weighed them, and he found he did not wish to take them back. He gave the order, and it was a strange thing to sit across from her a quarter-hour later at one end of the great table meant for 40, with the candles making a small warm island in all that dark, and to watch her eat with the same quiet composure she had worn on the steps. She did not fall upon the food as a starved thing might, nor did she pretend she was not hungry, which would have been its own kind of lie. She ate as she did everything, it seemed, honestly, without apology, taking what was set before her and being neither greedy of it nor ashamed. "You are studying me, your grace," she said without looking up. "I do not mind it. But you will learn nothing you have not already guessed. I am exactly what I appear. There is very little of me held back, and none of it worth the searching for. That," he said, "is precisely why I study you. In my experience, there is always a great deal held back. I have spent 20 years learning to find it. I confess I do not know quite what to do with a person who has hidden nothing." She looked up then, and there was something almost like pity in her face, though it was not aimed at herself. "How lonely that must be," she said quietly, "to have spent 20 years certain that everyone about you is concealing a knife." She said it without triumph, and without any wish to press the advantage the words gave her, and then she returned to her plate and left him with it. As one leaves a door open and does not insist a man walk through. He thought of the woman who had jilted him, of the soft speeches she had made him while her heart was let elsewhere to a marquess with older money, and he understood that Pernille Fairholt had, in a sentence, laid bare the whole architecture of his reserve and declined to use it against him. Lady Marchburn would have filed it away as a weapon. Half the county would have. This girl, sold to him for a sum, owing him her family's rescue, had been handed the one true key to the Duke of Nethercombe and had set it gently down upon the table between them, untouched. "You should rest," he said at last, when the candles had burned low. He rose and she rose, and for the space of a breath they stood in the small island of light, nearer than they had yet been, and he was aware of her as he had not permitted himself to be aware of anyone in a very long time. The wariness about her eyes, the steadiness beneath it, the plain courage of a woman who had walked into the coldest house in the county and named its grief aloud within the hour. A servant came to take her up to the rooms that had been made ready, the Duchess' apartments, aired for the first time in a generation, that his mother had died in and that no woman had entered since. Pernille inclined her head to him, the correct degree and no more, and followed the candle up the great staircase, small and grey and straight-backed, her one poor trunk going up behind her. He should have gone to his study. There were letters. There was the everlasting business of the estate. There was every reason in the world to turn from the foot of the stairs and put the whole disquieting arrival behind him, and file the girl under the heading of an obligation discharged, and think no more of her than her family had. He did not go to his study. He stood at the bottom of the great staircase of Nethercombe long after the light of her candle had turned the corner of the landing and gone, watching the empty stone where she had been, and he found, with something between alarm and a feeling he had no wish to name, that he could not look away. For 3 days after her arrival, the Duke of Nethercombe conducted himself as a man who had settled a matter and wished to hear no more of it. He rose before the household, rode the frozen home farm until his hands were numb inside his gloves, and shut himself into his study with the ledgers and his steward's honest despair, and he told himself that this was the whole of his business with the woman under his roof, that she would be married and housed and provided for, and that a man did not owe his conscience anything further to a bargain he had made with his eyes open. He told himself this a great many times, which ought to have been the first warning, for a thing truly settled does not require to be settled again each morning before breakfast. He did not go up to the Duchess's apartments, but he learned, in the way a man learns things he has forbidden himself to ask after, that she rose early too, that she had gone down to the kitchens on the second day and thanked the cook by name for a supper she could not have found generous, that she had walked out alone in the bitter park with a shawl about her shoulders and been seen, by a gardener who reported it as a marvel, to stop and speak with the man about the espaliers as though she meant to know the place. She asked nothing of the house. She took no liberties with it. She moved through Nethercombe like a guest who expected at any hour to be told she had overstayed, and the very smallness of her demands upon him worked upon Kelby more than any demand could have done, for he had spent his life among people who wanted, and did not know what to make of a woman who seemed only to be waiting quietly to see what would be required of her. It was his aunt who ended the truce. Lady Marchburn came to his study on the 4th morning, planted her cane upon the carpet, and informed him that the subscription assembly at Combeferre's was to be held that Thursday se'nnight, and that the future Duchess of Nethercombe would attend it upon his arm. "The grand ball is a month off," she said, "and a month is a long while for the county to whisper unanswered. Better they have their first look at her among the fiddles and the negus, where a slip may be laughed off, than to save the whole of their curiosity for the night that matters. Let them stare their fill of her early, and let them see you stand up with her, so there can be no mistaking that the thing is done. She studied him a moment with her hard, pale, ivory face. You need not enjoy it, Kelby. You need only be seen to permit it. He agreed because there was no sound reason to refuse, and told himself that too was a thing decided and done with. He did not examine why, that Thursday, he found himself in the Great Hall a full quarter hour before the carriage was ordered, nor why his eyes went at once to the staircase when a step sounded upon it. She came down in grey. Of course, she came down in grey. A plain grey silk this time rather than the plain grey wool, with a narrow edging of darker ribbon at the sleeve that was the single concession her wardrobe or her spirit had made to the occasion, and no jewel at her throat but the pale of her own skin above the collar. Beside the plumed and glittering women he had squired to 100 such rooms, she would look, he knew, like a wren set down in an aviary of birds bred for their colour. And yet she came down the great stone stair without hurry and without apology, straight-backed and grey and entirely herself, and Kelby found that the sight of her did not embarrass him, as his aunt plainly feared it would. It steadied him. He handed her into the carriage himself, and if his hand closed a half-instant longer than courtesy strictly asked, neither of them remarked upon it aloud. The assembly rooms at Combeferre's were the pride of the little market town and the whole of its social ambition. A long-panelled chamber above the corn exchange, hung with wax lights and a smell of tallow and orange water, its boards chalked for the dance and its walls lined already, when the Duke's party entered, with every family of consequence for 20 miles who had come, as his aunt had promised, to stare. The music faltered as they came in. It always did when he came in. He was used to the small hush that ran ahead of him through any room, the faces turning, the calculation and the caution. What he was not used to was the second sound that followed it, low and quick and passed fan to fan behind gloved hands, the whisper that was not for him at all, but for the small grey woman upon his arm. He felt her hand tighten once upon his sleeve, and then deliberately loose again. She had heard it too. She gave no other sign. They had not been 10 minutes in the room before the cousin found them. Augusta Denmark came across the floor in a froth of rose-coloured gauze and borrowed diamonds, her mother stout and puce in her wake, and she made her curtsy to the Duke so low and so lingering that half the room might admire the line of it. "Your Grace," she breathed, "how the whole county rejoices to see you here. And dearest Pernille." The ringlets tilted, the pretty face composed itself into a tenderness that did not reach the eyes. "How brave you look. How very brave. I said to Mama in the carriage, did I not, Mama, that not one girl in 100 would have the courage to stand up before all these grand people in the same grey she wears to church of a Sunday? I think it perfectly noble of you not to mind." "I do not mind, Augusta," said Pernille. "It is a good gown, and it is paid for, which is more than can be said of every gown in this room." It was said mildly, without heat, and it took Augusta a full second to feel the point of it slide home, for the diamonds at her own throat were hired, as half the county knew and the other half suspected, and there was a mantua maker in the town who had been 3 seasons whistling for the Denmark's account. Augusta's colour rose. Her mother made a strangled sound over her fan. And Kelby, who had schooled his face for 30 years into a mask that betrayed nothing, felt the corner of his mouth threaten him, and turned the threat into a cough behind his hand. But Augusta was not a woman to be routed by a single hit, and she had prepared her ground. She drew a cluster of them about her within the quarter hour. The Dowager Lady Pentworth, formidable in bombazine and famous for a tongue that had flayed better women than Pernille. The 2 Miss Carraways, who giggled on cue. A matron or 2 of the sort who take their opinions from whoever spoke last and loudest, and she conducted, in the centre of the room and in a voice pitched to carry, an entertainment upon the subject of her cousin's origins, as though relating the drollest thing in nature. In the count-house itself, I do assure you, ma'am, upon a high stool, adding up the columns, she was saying as Kelby, drawn by he knew not what, came within hearing along the wall. Her grandfather in coals, you understand, and the whole fortune got by the chevelful. Is it not the most diverting thing? We are all to curtsy to a duchess who can reckon the price of 100 weight of iron quicker than you, or I could name the figure of a country dance. I only hope, when she is mistress of Nethercombe, she will not take to keeping the household books herself, for I am sure the housekeeper would die of it. The Caraway girls tittered, though I dare say it is bred in the bone, and one cannot help what one is bred to. Poor thing. She cannot help it, and we must all be very kind. The Dowager Lady Pentworth turned her lorgnette upon Pernil, who had been drawn into the ring of them and stood at its edge with her hands folded and her face quite still. "And can you reckon, Gel?" the old woman demanded, in the tone she might have used to a performing dog. "Is it true what your cousin says? Coals and counting houses?" The room, or so much of it as had gathered to watch, went quiet enough. Kelby heard the wax gutter in the sconce beside him. He was already moving. He was aware, distantly, that he was moving, that his feet had carried him a pace, and then another out from the wall without any order from his will, that in a moment he would be standing in the middle of this and doing he knew not what. And that his aunt across the room had seen it and gone rigid. He had crossed half the distance when Pernil answered, and her answer stopped him where he stood. "It is true, my lady," she said. Her voice was low and perfectly even, and it carried, because she did not trouble to raise it, and so the room leaned in to catch it. "My grandfather began upon a high stool in a counting house, and ended it owning the iron and the men who dug it and the ships that carried it, and he built with his own hands the fortune that a good many older names in this room were glad enough to borrow against in a hard winter. I learned to reckon at his knee, and I am not ashamed of it. A woman who knows the price of things is not easily cheated of her money or of her worth." She let that rest a moment, and then she looked, not at the dowager, but full and level at her cousin. And there was no cruelty in her face at all, which was somehow worse for Augusta than any there could have been. "You need not be kind to me, Augusta. I have never asked it of you, and I find I do very well without it. Save your kindness for someone who requires it. There may come a day you are glad to have it by you." It was not a rout. It was not a triumph. She did not raise her voice or flush or reach for a wit that would wound. She only stood in the grey silence she had made and let the truth of herself be seen. And it was the Dowager Lady Pentworth, who respected nothing on earth but iron of one kind or another, who ended it with a short bark of laughter and a rap of her lorgnette upon her palm. "Ha, Coulson iron. Well, there's more backbone in the grey one than in a ballroom full of the pink, and I've said longer things and meaner and been half as right." "Duke," she swung upon Kelby, who had come to a halt 3 feet from the whole tableau and stood there caught plainly, in the very act of a rescue that had proved unneeded. "You've done better for yourself than the county gives you credit for. Steer yourself and dance with the Gel before some cleverer man does it in your place." He should have been grateful the thing had settled itself. He was not. He found, standing there, that some part of him regretted arriving too late to do the settling that he had wanted. With a violence that startled him, to be the one to answer the old woman and the cousin and the whole sneering pretty room on her behalf, and that the wanting had brought him out into the open floor in front of them all before he had counted the cost of it. So he did the only thing that would make sense of his own position, and it was the thing his aunt had told him to do, and the thing his blood had been urging since the music faltered at the door. He bowed to her, there, before the assembled county. "Miss Fairholt," he said, "the next is forming. Will you stand up with me?" He saw the flicker of it cross her face. Surprise, quickly folded away, and something beneath the surprise that she did not let him name. She put her gloved hand into his, and the Duke of Nethercombe, who had not stood up at a public assembly in 7 years, who had let a whole county decide he was too proud or too cold or too broken to dance, led his grey betrothed out into the centre of the chalked floor, and turned to face her while the fiddlers found their key, and every eye in the room upon them, and let them look. She danced well. That surprised him, though he could not have said why it should. Plainly a woman raised to be overlooked had learned her steps in some cold schoolroom and practiced them for a stage she had never expected to be given, and she gave the figure its due gravely, without coquetry. Her hand light and cool in his at each turn, her eyes meeting his and not sliding away in the practiced half-flirtation he had endured from 100 partners. When the dance brought them together down the line, he found he had things to say to her, which was itself a novelty. He had spent 7 years having nothing he wished to say to anyone. "You did not need me," he said low as the figure closed them for a moment. "I came to fight your battle and found it won." "You came," she said. "That was the whole of what mattered. The winning I can manage. It is the standing alone I had grown tired of. and then as the turn parted them and drew them back, "You need not have. It will cost you something with these people, to be seen to care whether they are kind to me. I would not have you spend more on this bargain than you meant to. I begin to think," he said, "that I did not know, when I struck it, what I meant to spend." She had no answer to that, or none she would give upon a public floor with the caraway girls counting their turns. But her hand at the next joining closed upon his the way it had in the carriage, a half instant longer than the figure asked, and let go. When the dance ended, he did not return her to his aunt's circle, nor to the wall of watching matrons. He drew her instead through the press toward the tall windows at the end of the room, where a card table's overflow had left a quiet corner beyond the reach of the fiddles, and there, half screened by a bank of hothouse laurel some Combeferre's alderman had provided at great expense, they were for a moment nearly alone. "You should go back among them," she said. "They will talk. They talk regardless. I have 30 years' evidence of it." He looked at her, the plainness of her, the grey, the steadiness that was not calm at all, but courage smooth with long use, the wariness about the eyes that the candlelight found and that no one in that glittering room had troubled to see. "You told your cousin she may one day be glad of a kindness. You meant it. You were not scoring off her." "No." She turned her face a little toward the dark windows and the black night beyond them. "I have been where Augusta is going. Not the cruelty, I hope I was never that, but the fear underneath it. She is handsomer than I shall ever be, and cleverer than she is given credit for, and she was raised to believe that a good marriage was the one thing standing between her and the cold, and now she watches the coronet she was promised in her cradle go to the cousin she was taught to despise. She is frightened, your grace. Frightened people are cruel because it is the only power left them. I know how that tastes. I will not pretend to like her. But I cannot make myself hate a thing I understand." Kelby was silent. He had gone into rooms all his life with his own lockdown behind the cold face his griefs had given him, and called it dignity, and here was a woman who had looked her own fear full in the face and come out of it not hard, as he had, but merciful, and he did not know what to do with the difference between them except to feel it, keenly, like a lamp brought to a room he had kept dark on purpose. "You do not flatter me," he said at last. "In 3 days you have not once told me a thing you thought I wished to hear." "Would you have me?" She looked back at him grave. "You have a house full of people paid to tell you pleasant things, and a county full of people who tell you them for nothing, hoping to be paid later. I have not the talent for it, and I should think you have had a surfeit. I will give you the truth, or I will give you my silence. They are the only 2 coins I came into this marriage owning." A small, tired, unlooked-for warmth touched the corner of her mouth. "And I find I would rather spend them on you than hoard them. Make of that what you will." The fiddles struck up again beyond the laurel. Somewhere his aunt would be searching the room for him with her hard, bright eye. Somewhere Augusta was rebuilding her ruined poise. The whole machinery of the evening ground on, and would want him back inside it. And Kelby, Duke of Nethercombe, stood in the small green quiet at the end of the assembly room and understood, with a clarity that frightened him more than the ledgers ever had, that he did not want to go back into it. He wanted to stay exactly here. Screened by an alderman's laurel with a grey woman who owned nothing but the truth in her silence, and go on hearing her speak, and keep on answering for as long as the candles held, and that this wanting was not a thing his aunt had arranged, nor a thing the bargain had bought, nor a thing that any amount of resolution taken before breakfast was going to be able now to command. In the end it was his aunt who came for him, as he had known she would, her cane finding him out behind the alderman's laurel with the unerring instinct of a woman who had spent 40 years locating people where they ought not to be. She said nothing of the corner, nor of the grey woman standing quietly in it. She only reminded him, in the flat tone of reading a bill of fare, that the Pentworths expected a word and the master of ceremonies another, and that a duke who had troubled himself to appear at Combeferre's might at least be seen to have appeared. Kelby went. He made his bows and answered what was asked of him, and let the Dowager Lady Pentworth rap his sleeve and tell him twice more that there was more iron in the grey one than in the whole pink drawing-room, and through all of it some idle, unquiet part of him kept the far window in the tail of his eye, where Pernille had gone back among the matrons and stood being talked at with her hands folded and a chin level, bearing it as she bore everything, and not once looking to him to be rescued from it. He did not stand up with her again. He wanted to, which was precisely why he did not. He had already given the county more to chew upon in one evening than had been fed in 7 years. And he had learned long ago that a man who shows the world where his tenderness lies has handed it the map to the one place it will most enjoy burning. So he kept to the far side of the room and let the fiddles saw out the last of the country dances. And when at length the candles had guttered low in their sconces and the negro boy clock above the door struck the hour that permitted a person of consequence to leave without insult to his hosts, he collected his aunt and his betrothed and handed them both into the carriage. And the doors were shut upon the cold, and the horses leaned into the traces, and combeferres fell away behind them into the dark. Lady Marchbann slept, or affected to. Within a mile of the town her chin had settled into the fur at her collar, and her breath came slow and even, and whether it was true sleep or only the good manners of a woman who knew when her presence had ceased to be useful, Kelby did not inquire. The carriage lamp swung on its hook and threw a small moving world of amber across the three of them, and beyond the glass the hedgerows ran black and endless under a sky scoured clean of cloud, hard with stars. Pernille sat across from him with her hands in her lap and her face turned to the window, and for a long while neither of them spoke, and the silence was not the strained and waiting silence of strangers but something else, something he had no ready word for. A quiet two people keep together on purpose, because speech would only spoil it. "You are cold," he said at last, for he had seen the small suppressed movement of her shoulders. "It is a cold night." "I do not mind it." But when he reached without deciding to and drew the fur carriage rug from the seat beside him, and leaned across the swaying dark to lay it over her knees, she did not refuse it, nor thank him with the effusion that would have made the gesture foolish. She only looked at him a moment in the swinging amber light, and drew the rug closer and then said, "Lo, you are always doing that, giving a thing and looking as though you hoped I had not noticed. Am I? You handed me down from the carriage the first night when there was no one to see you do it. You came across the whole width of that room tonight to fight a battle I had already won. And now the rug." A ghost of that tired warmth moved at the corner of her mouth. "For a man determined to feel nothing, your grace, you are a great deal of trouble to yourself." He might have turned it aside. He had turned aside 1,000 such openings in his life, with a coldness that closed the subject and the person who had raised it in the same breath. He found, in the rocking dark with his aunt breathing slow across the way and the stars wheeling beyond the glass, that he did not wish to. "I had thought," he said, "that a man might make a small comfortable place inside a hard bargain without the bargain itself being changed by it. I begin to suspect I was mistaken in that." She said nothing, but her eyes held his across the little swaying space between them longer than was safe. Longer than either of them had leave to allow, until the carriage struck a rut, and the lamp jumped and the moment broke, and she looked back to the black window and he to his, and neither of them mended what had been said, because there was no mending it, and both of them knew it. The days that followed were not, on their surface, changed. Kelby rose and rode the home farm. He sat with his steward over the drainage of the low meadows and the price of seed corn. He answered the letters that a great estate breeds as a marsh breeds midges. But a man may keep to the whole shape of his old life and find the meaning gone out of it, like a house whose furniture stands where it always stood, while the family that used it has quietly moved to other rooms. He found himself listening for her step in the corridors. He found that the hour after dinner, which for 7 years he had spent alone with a book he did not read and a fire he did not feel, had become the 1 hour of the day he could not have surrendered for the whole of the rest of it, for she had taken to sitting with him in the library. At first by his stiff invitation and then by a custom that needed none, she with some plain mending in her lap and he with the ledgers, the two of them saying little and that little worth more to him than all the brilliant talk he had endured across 100 London dinner tables. It was in the library, 3 days after the assembly, that she told him the rest of it. He had not asked. He had learned already that she gave nothing to a question that she would not sooner give unasked, and that the surest way to close her was to pry. But the fire had burned low and companionable, and the wind was walking in the chimney, and she had set down her mending and was looking into the coals with the particular stillness he had come to know meant she was somewhere far from the room, when she said, without turning, "You have never asked me why they sold me so cheap." Kelby set down his pen. I did not think it my business to ask. No. She was quiet a moment. My father is not a wicked man, your grace. I would not have you think it. He is a frightened one, which in the end wears much the same coat. My grandfather made the money, all of it, out of the coal and the iron and 40 years of rising before the light, and my father inherited it and had none of the gift that made it, and he has spent the whole of my life watching it run out between his fingers like water and blaming the water. There were debts I was not meant to know of. There is a man in York who held my father's paper and would have had him in the spunging house by Lady Day, and once a man of that station is taken for debt, he does not come out again whole, nor does his family. I have 3 younger sisters. The eldest of them is 15. She turned her head then and looked at him, and there was no plea in it, and no self-pity, only the plain accounting of a woman who had reckoned the sum long ago and paid it without complaint. When your aunt's letter came, offering what it offered, my father wept at the table, not for me, for himself and for being saved and a little, I think, from shame. And I looked at my sisters, and I did the sum as I was taught to do, and I told him I would go. It was not a sacrifice, whatever the poets would make of it. It was the plainest arithmetic in the world. £60,000 against 4 lives and a name. Any child of a counting house could tell you which way that reckons. The fire settled with a soft collapse of ash. Kelby had risen. Though he did not remember rising, he stood by the hearth now, looking down at her upturned face in the low red light, and he was conscious of a great and unaccustomed anger, though not at her, and not quite at the frightened man in the north either, but at the whole ordered cruelty of a world that could take such a woman and price her by the head like a beast at a fair and call the transaction respectable, because a coronet stood at one end of it. You speak of it, he said, and his voice was not steady, as though it were nothing. As though you had bought a length of ribbon. Should I weep instead? She said it gently. I wept once, the night before I came away, where none of them could hear me, and then I put it by, because tears are a luxury, your grace, and I was never bred to luxuries. My sisters are safe. My father sleeps, and I am not, as it happens, so very badly off as I feared to be, for I was promised to a cold house and a colder man, and I have found the house is only sad, and the man. She stopped. The colour came up in her face, and she looked down at the mending in her lap, and did not finish it. The man, Kelby said. You should not make me say it, she said very low. It is not in the bargain that I should say it. He should have let it go. Every year of his careful, armoured life stood at his shoulder, and counselled him to let it go, to be grateful for the honesty, and to ask no more of it, to keep the small warm place inside the hard arrangement and not go breaking down the walls that made it safe. But he had knelt, he realized. He was down on one knee upon the hearthrug before her chair, which was no posture for a Duke of Nethercombe and no posture he had chosen, and she had lifted her face again, and they were nearer than they had been in the carriage. Near enough that he could see the firelight moving in her eyes, and the fine tremor she was fighting to keep out of her breath, and the whole of the room and the estate and the ruined years had narrowed to the little space of warm air between her face and his. Pernil. He had never said her name before, not so, not without the Miss Fairholt or the Your Grace to fence it in, and it came out of him rough and quiet like something long shut up. He raised his hand. He did not know what he meant. To touch her cheek. To tuck back the strand of plain brown hair the firelight had turned to bronze at her temple. To do at last the thing his blood had been urging since a hired carriage rolled her muddy and unwanted into his courtyard, and she had come down its step without waiting for a hand. His fingers had crossed half the distance. He could feel already the warmth that came off her skin. She did not draw back. That was the thing that stopped him, that she did not draw back, that she sat still and let him come, her breath held, her hands gripping the poor mending in her lap. Trusting him not to make of the moment a thing she would have to be ashamed of on top of everything else she had borne without shame. And it was that trust, and not any coldness of his own, that closed his hand upon the empty air and drew it back before it reached her, for he understood, kneeling there with his heart going like a boy's, that this woman had been bought and sold and reckoned by the head, and that if he took what he wanted of her now, in the firelit dark, before ever he had given her a single thing she had not first been paid to accept, then he would be one more man who had used her want against her, and he would sooner have burned Nethercombe to the ground. So he did not touch her. He took, instead, the hand that lay upon her mending, that plain, capable, counting-house hand that could reckon the price of iron quicker than the county could name a country dance, and he raised it, and bent his head over it, and he pressed his mouth to the backs of her cold fingers, once, gravely, for a long moment. The way a man makes a vow he has not yet found the words for, and when he lifted his head he saw that her eyes were bright, too bright, and that she had turned her face away so that he should not see her master it. "There is a great deal," he said low, "that is not in the bargain. I find I have stopped consulting it. Do not," she whispered, "do not say a thing to me tonight that you will have to unsay by daylight. I could not bear to be given a thing and then have it taken back. I have had enough in my life of being got out of the way. I would rather you were only cold to me, your grace, and honest in it, than warm tonight and sorry in the morning." "I have not been sorry," he said, "for 1 hour since you came." And it was true, and the truth of it frightened him more than any lie could have done. For he had built the whole fortress of his life upon never again handing his heart across a table to be watched and weighed and traded for something better, and here he knelt with the drawbridge down and the gates flung wide, and he could not have raised them again to save himself. They sat a long while after in the falling firelight and said very little, and it was enough. When at last she rose to go up, he lit her candle for her from the branch on the table and gave it into her hand, and their fingers touched about the warm brass and lingered, and parted, and she went out and up the great cold stair with the small flame throwing her shadow tall against the ranked and guarded portraits of his line, and Kelby stood in the doorway of his library and watched her go until the last of the light had turned the corner of the gallery, and knew himself 38, wholly and finally undone. He did not hear the other footstep on the flags behind him until it was almost at his shoulder. "How very touching," said Augusta Denmark. She had come down, it seemed, for a book, or for a glass of water, or for nothing at all but the thing she had found. She stood in the mouth of the dark corridor in a wrapper of figured silk with a candle of her own held up before her, and its light fell on a face from which all the pretty ballroom softness had been wiped clean away. She had seen. He understood at once, from the still and studying look of her, how much she had seen, the candle given, the fingers lingering, whatever her cousin's shadowed face had shown as it climbed the stair, and he understood, too, in the same cold instant, that he had made a grave error in ever letting Augusta Denmark believe this marriage was the hollow thing his aunt had bargained for. A hollow marriage cost her nothing. A hollow marriage she could have borne, could even have in Merryover biding her time, for she had come north. He saw plainly now, in the settled expectation that the plain grey cousin would be married and shelved and forgotten, and that the coronet everyone had promised Augusta in her cradle was only mislaid a little while, not truly lost. But a Duke of Nethercombe on his knee upon a hearthrug was another matter altogether. "I am glad to find you awake, your grace," she said, and her voice was sweet again, wholly recovered, which was somehow worse than the naked look had been. "For I had begun to fear no one in this house was awake to what is happening in it. My poor Aunt Marchburn toils so to make a respectable thing of this marriage, and here is the bridegroom, the candle tilted, taken in the empty firelit room, the 2 chairs drawn close, the abandoned mending, forgetting that it was only ever meant to be a marriage of appearances. One does hope, sir, that you will not let a little firelight and a soft voice cost you your good sense. People will talk so, when a man of your rank is seen to lose his head over a girl who came to him out of a counting-house to pay her father's debts. It would be a great pity if the whole county came to your ball next month only to laugh at you. There is nothing," she said and smiled, and it did not reach her eyes any more than it had at the assembly, so ridiculous as a proud man in love with the wrong woman. "I should hate to see you made ridiculous, cousin. I shall lie awake thinking how it might be prevented." She dropped him a small mocking curtsy and turned, and went back up into the dark with her candle, and left him standing in the doorway of his library with the fire dying at his back and the cold certainty settling over him, sure as the frost upon the park, that she had not come down for a book at all, and that the month between this night and the ball was going to be a very long one. The night of the grand ball came down upon Nethercombe in a fall of hard bright frost, and the great house that had stood half-shuttered for 7 years woke to it like a thing brought back from the dead. Kelby stood at the head of the double stair while the servants ran the last of the wax up into 1,000 sconces below him, and watched his own hall fill with light he had ordered lit for no better reason than that he had wished to see her stand in it, and knew the wish for what it was, and did not trouble any longer to call it by another name. He had spent a month failing to command his own heart before breakfast. He had given the campaign up somewhere in the second week, on a wet afternoon in the long library with a grey woman reading opposite him in a silence so easy it had frightened him worse than any quarrel, and he had not taken it up again. A man could not fight a country he had already surrendered to. He had meant tonight to end the pretense. Not aloud, not yet, he had not the words and feared them, but to let the county see, past all mistaking, that the Duke of Nethercombe held the woman on his arm to be his wife in earnest and not in name. That the grey wren they had come to sneer at was mistress of every stone of this place and of the man who owned it. He had ordered it in his mind like a campaign. He had not reckoned that the county had come with a campaign of its own. She came down to him in silver grey. The one true extravagance he had persuaded her to accept, a gown the colour of frost on slate, cut plain as always, but cut by a hand that knew its work, and at her throat, because she had let him win that small battle at least, the single strand of Nethercombe pearls his mother had worn. She looked coming down that stair like something the winter had made on purpose and kept for him alone, and Kelby forgot for a moment the crowded hall and the watching faces and simply looked at her, openly, as he had not let himself look at anything in 7 years. "You are staring, Your Grace," she said quietly, reaching the last step. "I am. I find I have decided to stop apologizing for it." He took her gloved hand and set it upon his sleeve and covered it a moment with his own. "Stay near me tonight, whatever is said. I would have them see us as one thing." Something moved behind her eyes, quick and warm and quickly folded down, as it always was. She guarded her hope the way he had guarded his heart, and he had come to read the small motions of that guarding as another man might read tenderness spoken plain. "I have been near you all month," she said. "It is the standing away that I have found the labour." For an hour it was everything he had wished. He led her the length of the hall on his arm, and named her to the county with the whole weight of his rank behind the naming. He stood up with her twice, which set every fan in the room fluttering. He watched the Dowager Lady Pentworth bark her rough approval, and the harder heads begin, grudging and slow, to follow where the old woman led. Once turning her beneath his hand in the figure of the dance, he had bent his head and said low, for her alone, "I think I have been a very great fool for a very long time, and I mean to say so properly before the night is out, where there is no music to hide behind." And she had missed no step, but her hand had tightened in his, and she had answered, "Then say it plainly when you say it." "I have had a lifetime of things half meant." He had laughed, actually laughed aloud in his own hall, a sound the county had not heard from in years, and half the room had turned to stare at the miracle of it. He watched Augusta Denmark across the floor in her froth of rose and hired brilliance, watched the pretty face work to keep its composure as the evening ran plainly against her, and felt something almost like pity, remembering what Pernille had said of fear and the cruelty it breeds. That frightened people are cruel because it is the only power left them, and that one watches a coronet promised in the cradle go to the cousin one was taught to despise. He should have remembered too that a frightened creature is never more dangerous than when it is cornered, and that he had spent the whole month letting his guard down inch by inch before the very eyes that hated him for the easing of it. The blow fell just before the supper dance, at the fullest hour of the night, when the greatest number of eyes were free to see it. It began with a small commotion near the card-room door, a raised voice, a flurry. Augusta's mother stout and puce and calling for attention, with a handkerchief pressed to her bosom as though overcome, and then Augusta herself came out into the middle of the floor, with a folded paper held up in one gloved hand, and her face composed into a marvel of reluctant sorrow, and she said, in the carrying voice she had used at Combeferre's to such effect, forgive me all of you, but I cannot in conscience stand silent and see so good a man deceived beneath his own roof." The fiddles died in a straggle. The floor cleared as though a wind had crossed it. Kelby felt Pernille go very still at his side. "I did not seek this," Augusta went on, and there was a shine of tears in her eyes that Kelby even then half believed. "I would to God I had never found it. But it was among her things. A maid brought it to me, not knowing what she did. And when I read what was in it, I knew I could not let this house and this name be made a jest of before the whole county. Your Grace. She turned to him and held the paper out across the sudden silence, and her hand trembled, whether with fear or triumph he could not tell. Read it. Read whose hand it is in, and to whom it is writ, and what she says is in it of you, and then tell me I did wrong to bring it. He did not take it. He stood, and the old cold face came down over him like a visor dropping, the face the county had learned to read as a warning, and behind it something had begun very quietly to bleed. You will explain yourself, he said, or you will leave my house. It is a letter, Augusta said, and now the tears were falling, and they made her lovelier, and Kelby hated with a sudden violence how well they served her. In her own hand. Writ this fortnight past, you may see the date upon it, and the ink scarce dry, to a man named Reed. Thomas Reed, a clerk and nobody out of that counting house she is so proud of. She writes to him that her heart was ever his and is his still. That she has married your Grace only for the fortune, that she means to see her family safe and this man Reed provided out of the Nethercombe coffers, and that when it is done, when the money is secured, she will, Augusta's voice broke, prettily, she will come back to him, to Reed. She calls you, in it, a cold proud fool who was easily got. Those are her words, your Grace. Her own hand. I have them here. The silence in the great hall was the silence of 100 people holding their breath at once. Kelby heard the wax gutter in the sconces. He heard, from very far off, the beating of his own blood. He knew this. That was the horror of it, standing there in the ruin of his own bright evening. He knew this shape, this exact shape. He had lived inside it for 7 years and built a whole cold life upon its walls. A woman he had let himself believe in. A letter, or a look, or a laughing word at a supper table, and all the world watching to see how the proud Duke would take his medicine. He had sworn, at 29, standing white and silent through a London season while every drawing-room in the town passed the tale of his jilting hand to hand, that he would never again put his heart where a woman might hold it up to the light and let the world laugh. And here it was again. Here was the purse he had left open on the street, and here were the fingers in it, and here was the whole county leaning in to watch him understand. He turned to look at her. That was Augusta's whole art, and it very nearly served. She had not needed the letter to be true. She had needed only to build, out of half a truth and a forged line, and the exact machinery of his oldest wound, a moment in which he must turn and look at Pernille with the question naked in his face, and let the county see him look, and let Pernille see it too. For if he doubted her, even for the space of a breath, before all these people, then the thing was done whether the paper were true or false. Then he had shown the county that he believed her capable of it, and no marriage, real or feigned, survives the husband's face in that first unguarded instant, and Kelby doubted. For one terrible breath, standing in the wreck of the only hope he had let himself hold in 7 years, the old wound flared up through him like fire through dry thatch, and he thought, of course it was too much to have believed. Of course the grey stillness and the honest silences, and the way a hand had closed on his a half instant longer than the figure asked, of course it had all been the deepest art of all, the art that does not look like art. Played by a woman clever enough to reckon the price of an iron cargo and shrewd enough to see that a broken man is most easily got by seeming not to want him. He had been got once by a woman who wanted openly. How much easier to be got by one who wanted nothing and waited and let him come. The thought was there, whole and cold and reasonable, in the space of a single breath, and in that breath his face must have shown it, because he saw the thing he did to her with it. He saw the hope go out of her. She did not weep. She did not cry out that it was false, nor throw herself upon his mercy, nor turn upon her cousin with the quick landing which she owned. She looked at him, at his face, at whatever his face was doing in that unguarded instant, and he watched something close in her, quietly and completely, like a door shut against a cold she had known was coming all along. When she spoke, her voice was low and perfectly even, and it carried, because she did not trouble to raise it, and the room leaned in. May I see the letter, Augusta? Augusta gave it to her across the silence, with a little flourish of reluctance. Pernille unfolded it. Kelby watched her read it, watched her face take in whatever was written there, and saw, this he would remember longest, and understand only later, that she did not read it as a woman reads a forgery she has never seen. She read it as a woman reads something she recognizes. Her eyes went once, quickly, to a line near the foot of it, and her breath changed and her hand was not quite steady when it lowered the page. "The hand is mine," she said. The whole room let out its breath at once, a low ugly rush of sound, and Kelby felt it go through him like a blade turned in the wound. She had not denied it. She had stood in the middle of his hall with the county's eyes upon her and said, "The hand is mine," and every soul in that room had heard her half confess. "Pernil," he said. It came out of him rough, low, not meant for the room, and he could not have told whether it was a plea or an accusation. "Tell them it is false." She looked up at him, and there was no anger in her face, which was somehow worse than any anger could have been, and no plea in it either. Only a great and wary steadiness, and beneath the steadiness, where only he was near enough to see, the wound his one breath's doubt had dealt her. "I will not tell this room anything," she said quietly, to be believed the more for saying it loudly. "I told you once you should have the truth from me, or my silence, and that they were the only coins I owned. The hand upon this paper is mine. Some of the words are mine and were written a long time ago, in another life, to a boy I grew up beside, before ever your name was spoken over me like a sentence. And some of the words are not mine at all, and were never in any letter I wrote, and were put there by a hand that meant this. I know which is which, you cannot. That is the whole cruelty of the thing. It is built so that you cannot." She folded the page along its old creases slowly, and there was the ghost of something almost like compassion in it. "And so it comes to this, your grace, as I suppose it was always going to. You have looked at me tonight the way you looked at nothing else this month, and I will not forget that you did, but you looked at me just now another way, for only a moment, and I will not forget that either. A man is his second look, not his first. I was got cheaply once myself, by people who traded me for what I was worth. I promised myself I would not be got cheaply again, not even by a house full of pearls, and not even by you." She reached up then and unclasped the Nethercombe pearls from her throat, and Kelby could not move, could not speak, could only stand and watch her do it while the whole county watched with him. She held them out to him across the terrible little distance, and when he did not take them she set them, quite gently, into his open hand, and closed his cold fingers over them with both of hers as one closes the hand of a man who has lost something and does not yet know it. "They are your mother's," she said. "They were never mine to keep. I think you knew that better than I did when you struck this bargain. I only forgot it for a little while, a breath. I will trouble your house until morning, for there is no other place to go tonight, and then I will trouble it no more. You may put whatever tale of it about the county you like. I shall not contradict you. I have found, and here at last the steadiness thinned, just once, just enough for him to see clean through to the wreck beneath it, that I have not the heart tonight to fight for a thing that will not fight for me." She made him her curtsy, grave, correct, curtsy of a duchess and not of a wren, and she turned, and she walked the length of the great bright hall he had lit for her alone, unhurried, straight-backed, grey and silver and entirely herself, through the parting crowd and their whispering and their stares, and did not once look back. He had it in him to stop her. He knew that even then. 3 strides and a word, and the whole cold weight of his rank thrown down before her in front of them all, and the night might yet have turned, but the word did not come, because the old wound had his throat in its hand. And a man who has once been made a public fool for loving learns to fear that ruin above every other, even above the loss of the thing he loves, so he let her go. That was the true blow of the night, and he dealt it himself in silence, and would spend a long while learning to forgive himself for it, and Augusta Denmark stood weeping her lovely victorious tears in the middle of the floor, and the Dowager Lady Pentworth said something sharp that no one heeded. And Lady Marchburn's hard bright eye found her nephew across the room and read his face and went, for the first time in his memory, to stone, and Kelby, Duke of Nethercombe, stood alone in the ruin of the only night in 7 years he had let himself hope for, with his mother's pearls warming in his shut fist and the shape of her 2 hands still closing his fingers over them, and understood, too late, a whole breath too late, the width of a single doubt too late, that the county had not beaten him tonight. He had. That the wound 7 years old had reached up out of him at the one moment that mattered and struck the blow that all Augusta's cunning could never have struck alone. That the woman walking away from him down his own bright hall had told him the plain truth in a room full of lies. And he had answered her truth with a look, and she had seen it, and it had been enough. The doors at the end of the hall closed behind her grey figure with a sound very small and very final. And all around him the whispering rose, and the fiddles, uncertain, took up their tune again, and the cruel for tonight had won. The necklace lay in the middle of the great floor where Augusta Denmark had let it slither from her fingers, a coil of cold white fire upon the polished oak, and for the space of 3 heartbeats no one in the crowded hall of Nethercombe moved or breathed. 200 candles burned in the sconces and the great branched stands, and every one of them, it seemed to the Duke, was fixed upon the small grey figure standing alone in the cleared space at the foot of his mother's portrait, with the whole county ranged in silk and jewels about her like a court assembled for a hanging. "There," said Augusta into that silence, and her voice carried sweet and clear to the farthest corner of the hall, for she had chosen her moment as a general chooses his ground. The Nethercombe diamonds that his late Grace's mother wore, and her mother before her, found not an hour ago in a workbox in the Duchess's own dressing room, wrapped in a counting-house rag, made ready to go out of the house. I would have spared her this. Believe me, cousin, I would have spared us all the shame of it, but I could not stand by and watch the name of Nethercombe stripped bare by a creature who came to us out of a debtor's ledger, and has been counting the plate since the hour she arrived. She turned slowly, so that the candlelight might find her tears, and they were tears, and they were very prettily done. Read the letter if you doubt me. Read it aloud, so that no one may say afterward that Augusta Denmark told a falsehood. The letter had been passed, hand to gloved hand, until it reached old Sir Marmaduke Coyle, who was deaf enough to read anything aloud without shame, and he held it to the branch of candles and read, in his cracked carrying bellow, a letter that begged one Josiah Pring, money-lender of Threadneedle Street, to have patience but a little longer, that the writer was now got safely inside the walls of Nethercombe, that the diamonds alone would clear the whole of her father's 11,000 and leave a tidy sum besides, that she cared not a farthing for the cold, proud man she had been sold to, and would strip his house to the wainscot, and be gone before the county was any the wiser. It was signed in a small sloping hand, with the name Pernille Fairholt. The Duke of Nethercombe stood at the edge of that cleared floor, and felt the old wound open in him like a door blown wide in a wind. He had sworn it should never happen twice. He had built the whole grey architecture of his life upon its never happening twice. The buried parents, the guarded face his fathers had all worn, the marriage struck for appearances precisely, because an arrangement could not lie and therefore could not wound. And here it was again, the soft voice and the false speech, the woman who had wanted the coronet and not the man. Here was the proof of it read out in a dead man's bellow before every soul whose good opinion he had ever been taught to value. For one black instant, one instant he would spend the rest of his life ashamed of. The Duke believed it. He looked at his wife across the width of the shining floor, and something in his chest went cold and shut, and Augusta, watching him with the whole of her clever attention, saw it go cold and knew that she had won. Pernille did not weep. That was the thing he would remember afterward, when the shame of that instant came upon him in the small hours, that she did not weep, nor plead, nor look to him to save her. She stood in her plain grey gown among all that borrowed splendour with her chin at the exact honest angle he had first seen at her aunt's breakfast table, and she let the reading finish, and then she spoke, and her voice was low and quite steady, with no tremble in it at all. "It is a very good letter," she said. "It is written on bath-pressed paper, hot-pressed, of the kind that is kept in the little writing-room off the Yellow Saloon. I have seen it there, for I dusted the standish myself last week when the maids were run off their feet with the ball. And it is a very fair copy of my hand. Whoever made it studied the household book, where I have written out the linen lists this fortnight past." She looked for the first time, not at the Duke and not at the county, but full at her cousin. "I am glad of one thing only, Augusta. I am glad you had it read aloud, for now everyone in this room has heard you say a thing you could not have known." "I have said nothing but the truth," said Augusta, but a little quickly. "You said the diamonds were found wrapped in a rag in a workbox in my dressing room." Pernille did not raise her voice. If anything, it dropped, so that the hall leaned toward her to hear. "But I have no workbox in my dressing room. My mending I keep in a basket by the fire in the little sitting room, where the Duke has seen it, for we have sat there of an evening. There is no workbox in the whole of the Duchess's apartments, save one." There is an old rosewood workbox that was the late Duchess's that has stood locked these 30 years in the bottom of the great press, and the key to it hangs upon the housekeeper's ring and upon no other in this house. I have never opened it. I did not know until this moment that anything at all was inside it, so I will ask you, before all these good people, the only question that signifies." She waited, and the silence stretched, and it was Augusta who could not bear it and looked away first. "How came you to know, cousin, that the diamonds were in a workbox, when you could not have known there was a workbox to find unless you had first put them there yourself? It was very quietly done, and it went through the hall like a crack running across ice." A woman near the Duke drew in her breath. Somewhere a fan stopped its fluttering. The whole bright company, that had assembled to watch and nobody put in her place, felt the floor tilt beneath its slippered feet and did not yet know which way it would slide. And the Duke, who had spent a lifetime reading the faces of men who wished to deceive him, watched his cousin's face and read there, plain as print, the one thing no innocence can counterfeit, the swift, cornered flick of the eyes that goes looking for a door. The Duke saw his Aunt Marchburn's face change first. Lady Marchburn, who had bargained this marriage and planned this ball, and stood now in puissant consequence at the head of her own creation, saw the pleasure drain out of it, and something like horror come up behind. And into the widening silence stepped a person no one had marked at all, old Mrs. Larch, the housekeeper, 44 years at Nethercombe, in her black bombazine and her chatelaine of keys, who had come down from the gallery where the upper servants were permitted to watch their betters dance. She was trembling, for she had never in her life spoken above a murmur in a room where the family stood, but she came forward to the edge of the candlelight with her chin working, and she spoke. "The key to that press hangs on my ring, your grace, and has hung there since your lady mother died in that room, and I have given it to no one." Her old voice shook and steadied. "Save that Miss Denmark's woman, Hislop, came to me a se'night since with a tale of moth in the winter woolens, and begged the ring of me but half an hour, and I, God forgive me for a fool, I let her have it, for she is a townish sharp creature and gave me no peace. I never once thought. She turned her streaming old face to Pernille, and dropped her a curtsy there before the whole county such as she would have given a reigning queen. My lady knows I speak the truth. My lady has been kinder to us below stairs in 6 weeks than some was in 6 years. My lady never had that key, and that was the moment it broke, for Hislop, Augusta's woman, was even then edging toward the servants' door at the side of the hall, and a footman, a great raw north country lad who had carried Pernille's poor single trunk up the stairs on the day she came, and had not forgotten it, set his shoulders in front of the door and would not let her by. And Augusta, seeing her own maid stopped and her own housekeeper turned against her, and the whole polished machinery of her cruelty seized and thrown into reverse before 200 witnesses, made the last mistake of a losing player and lost her temper. "You would take the word of servants," she cried, "over mine, over your own blood, for the sake of a grey little nobody who was bought and paid for like a sack of coals. She is nothing. She was always nothing. I was promised—" And there she stopped, but too late, a full breath too late, for the promise hung in the air of that hall plain for every ear, and every soul present understood in the same instant precisely what Augusta Denmark had believed was hers, and precisely how much the losing of it had cost her, and precisely what she had been willing to do to have it back. The Duke of Nethercombe crossed the floor. He was not aware of deciding to do it. He was aware only that the cold shut thing in his chest had blown open the other way, and that the shame of his one black instant of doubt was a live coal in him that he could not carry and stand still, and that between the crowd and his wife lay a stretch of shining oak that he covered in 6 strides while the whole county watched, the diamonds glittering forgotten on the boards where he stepped over them as a man steps over a fallen ribbon. Pernille turned as he came. He saw the steadiness in her go, at last, at the very last, now that was no longer needed, saw the tremble come into her chin that she had not permitted in the whole of her ordeal, and it undid him more thoroughly than any weeping could have done. "Kelby," she said very low only for him, "you should not. Before all these people it will make it worse for you. Let me only go quietly and—" He took her face between his 2 hands and he kissed her. He kissed her before the assembled county of 2 provinces. before his aunt and his ancestors and the deaf old baronet with the forged letter still hanging from his fingers, before Augusta Denmark with the promise still dying in the air about her, kissed her with a plainness and a completeness that no watcher could mistake and no gossip afterward soften. So that a duchess who had lifted skirts to sneer at the plain grey wife felt the whole ground of her malice go out from beneath her in a single stroke. He felt Pernille's hands come up and close upon his wrists, not to push him off but to hold on, as a person holds on in a high wind, and he felt under his mouth the small broken sound she made, and he gathered her in against him and did not let her go. When he lifted his head he did not lower his voice. He had spent 38 years lowering his voice, guarding his face, giving the world the shut grey front of a man who asked nothing of anyone, and he found he was done with all of it. "Hear me," he said, and the hall heard him, for a Duke of Nethercombe had never in 200 years needed to raise his voice to be obeyed. "This lady is my wife, not for appearances, not for her father's debts, which I paid gladly and would pay 10 times over. Not for the county's good opinion, which I find tonight I do not value at the price of one hair of her head." He looked once and only once at Augusta, and it was enough. She seemed to grow smaller inside her beautiful gown. "She is the truest heart that has come beneath this roof in my lifetime, and I have known it these many weeks, and been too great a coward to say it. I say it now. Whoever cannot honour the Duchess of Nethercombe may find their carriage. It is a cold night, but there are worse things than the cold, and I have had my fill of every one of them under this ceiling." No one moved toward the carriages. That was the curious thing, and he understood it even in the heat of the moment for what it was. The county had come, some of them, half hoping to see a duke made ridiculous and a nobody put in her place, and had got instead a duke unmasked as a man in love, which is a spectacle a great deal more affecting, and society which loves nothing so well as a fall, loves next best a reversal, and had turned its favour as a weathercock turns, all in an instant, and now looked upon Augusta Denmark with the cold curiosity it had meant to spend upon his wife. He saw Lady Marchburn, who understood the county better than any woman living, gather her skirts and move to her niece and take her hard by the wrist and begin, in a fierce undertone, to remove her from the field. Saw Augusta's pretty face come apart at last into something raw and childish and furious. Saw the footman step aside at last to let the maid Hislop scurry white-faced after her mistress into disgrace. The forged letter had fallen from Sir Marmaduke's fingers to the floor, and a lady's slipper trod upon it, unregarded, and that was the end of the reign of Augusta Denmark at Nethercombe, ended before all who had ever bowed to it. The Duke saw all of this at the edge of his sight and cared for none of it. He cared for the woman in his arms, who was shaking now in earnest, the long-strung courage of the whole terrible evening breaking in her all at once, and it came upon him, standing there with the music not yet dared to start again and the county pretending very hard to look elsewhere, exactly how near a thing it had been. An hour later, a quarter hour, and Augusta might have won. He might have let his old wound speak for him. He might have stood upon this floor and let them take his wife away branded a thief, and gone back to his ledgers and his frost and his shut grey life, and never known, never once suspected, that he had that night, with his own silence, thrown away the single true and living thing that had ever been offered to his keeping. The thought went through him colder than any accusation, and he tightened his arms about her as if the whole assembled county were still trying to take her from him. "Come away," he said against her hair. "Come out of this. You have borne enough for one night, and more than enough, and I will not have you bear the staring too. Let them look at one another a while. They have had their fill of looking at you." She lifted her face at that, and there was wonder in it more than anything, as though of all the impossible things the night had brought, the strangest by far was that the Duke of Nethercombe should be standing in the middle of his own ball with his arms about her, and the whole county forgotten. "You believed her," she said, not in reproach, only as one who must have the truth of a thing before she can carry it. "For a moment, I saw you believe her." He would not lie to her. He found he could not, that the habit of guarding himself had died somewhere upon that shining floor and would not be revived. "For a moment," he said, "I did. It is the worst thing I have ever done, and I have done a great many cold things. I will spend a long while making it right, if you will let me, but not here, and not tonight with all these candles and all these faces. Come." He turned her, his arm close about her, and made for the long doors at the end of the hall that stood open upon the terrace and the cold, clean dark beyond. And the crowd parted before them, murmuring, and some few, the better sort, the ones whose good opinion was perhaps worth having after all, inclined their heads to the Duchess of Nethercombe as she passed, the first true courtesies she had been paid in that house. Pernil kept her feet, and kept her chin up to the very threshold. But the night air struck her as they came out beneath the stars, and the last of the strength that had held her upright through accusation and letter and kiss went out of her all at once. She pressed the back of hand hard against her mouth, and a single sob broke from her that she could no longer govern, and she turned from him, turned away, out of some instinct older than reason, unwilling even now to let him see her weep, and went quickly down the shallow terrace steps toward the dark of the garden and the black hedges beyond, half running, her grey skirts pale in the starlight. For one heartbeat the Duke stood at the top of the steps and let her go, thinking to give her the mercy of a moment alone. Then he thought of a woman turning the corner of a gallery with a candle, and of every hour he had wasted in guarding a heart that had needed, all along, only the courage to be spent, and he thought of how nearly, this very night, he had let her walk out of his life while he stood upon a polished floor and said nothing, and he found that he could not so much as watch her cross the width of a garden without him. He went down the steps two at a time. Behind him the great lit hall fell away with all its ruin and its reversal, and before him the dark garden swallowed the pale flicker of her gown, and the Duke of Nethercombe, who had not run for any woman in the whole grey course of his life, went after her into the night at a dead run, calling her name, and then, in the very ruin of it, something turned. It was not courage that moved him first, nor even love, though both were in it before the end. It was the plain, small memory of her voice. I told you once you should have the truth from me, or my silence, and that they were the only coins I owned. Set against the 7 years he had built his whole cold house upon, and the staggering understanding, arriving all at once like a tide going over on the flat, that in all those years not one honest tongue had ever spoken to him so, and that he had just now believed a forger over the single soul who had never in a month of Sundays troubled to tell him a comfortable lie. Augusta wept her lovely tears in the middle of the floor. The county whispered. The fiddles felt their uncertain way back into the tune, and Kelby, Duke of Nethercombe, stood alone with his mother's pearls warm in his fist and looked down the length of the bright hall at the tall doors she had gone through, and knew, with a cold, clean certainty he had not owned in the space of an hour, that the wound 7 years old had made a fool of him one final time, and that he would be damned before he let it make a fool of her. He opened his hand and looked at the pearls a moment, still holding the heat of her 2 hands where she had closed his fingers over them. Then he shut his fist again and lifted his head, and the old iron face came down over him once more, but turned now the other way, turned at last upon the right quarry. The letter, he said. Give it here. Augusta faltered. It was the smallest thing, a hitch in the breath, a flicker of the pretty eyes toward her stout puce mother by the card-room door, but Kelby had spent a lifetime reading men across baize tables and battle lines, and he saw the fear go through her like a crack through ice. Your Grace, she began, I have already. She has confessed it, you heard her, the hand is her own, there is nothing to be. Give it here, said the Duke, in the voice that had once emptied a regiment's grumbling in 3 words, and Augusta Denmark put the folded paper into his hand, because there was no soul in that hall with the nerve to refuse him twice. He unfolded it under the light of 1,000 candles, and he did not read the words. He had done with reading words. Words were the whole of Augusta's art. He looked at the paper, held it up toward the sconces and turned it, and what he saw there any man who had ever kept a counting-house or a campaign chest would have seen too. The sheet was old. It was worn soft as cloth along its folds, the creases broken and furred with much opening, the surface gone the warm ivory that only years will bring to paper, a girl's letter years old, creased about the heart. And crowded at the foot of it, below where an old hand in faded brown ink had plainly once made its ending, ran 4 fresh lines in a blacker ink and a cramped, imitating hand, the ink so new it had scarcely sunk into the aged sheet, but stood upon it still raw and shining. You said it yourself, Kelby murmured, and though he did not raise his voice the whole hall heard him, for the whole hall had gone as silent as a church. Writ this fortnight past, you said. The ink scarce dry, He turned the paper about and held it high, the old faded body of it, and the new black lie crawling along its foot, so that those nearest could see, and those nearest told those behind. And so it is. The ink is scarce dry high, and here, and nowhere else upon the page. The rest is 5 years old if it is a day. This is a child's letter, madam, worn thin with keeping, and some coward has crept a fresh lie onto the bottom of an old truth and called the whole of it new. He lowered the page. Whose hand was it that added these lines, I wonder? For it was never the hand that wrote the rest. The one is a girl's round honest scrawl. The other has been drawn slow and copied by someone with a good letter of hers to work from, and a great deal of malice, and no gift for it at all. That is, you cannot. Augusta's voice climbed. A maid found it. I told you, a maid brought it out of her rooms. I know nothing of any. Then let us have the maid, said the Duke. She was fetched, a thin, frightened girl, and in a mob cap pushed to the front by the very people most eager now to be seen on the right side of the thing. And she took one look at the towering black figure of her master, and another at Augusta Denmark's whitening face, and did what frightened honest people do when a great terror is set against a lesser one. She chose the truth, because it was the only floor left under her feet. She had been given the letter already folded, she said, sobbing, by Miss Denmark's own woman, and a crown with it, and told only to say had found it among the mistress's things if ever she were asked. She had never been in the mistress's rooms in her life. The crown fell out of her apron onto the marble and rolled, ringing into the appalling silence, and lay there flat, and nobody picked it up. It was Lady Marchburn who ended it. Kelby's aunt had stood the whole while at the edge of the floor with her hard bright eye upon her nephew, but she had been born a Nethercombe before she was ever a Marchburn, and there was a thing that mattered to her more even than her disdain, and that was the name. She came forward now through the parting crowd, tall and terrible and 70 years old, and she looked once at the raw black lines upon the aged page, and once at Augusta Denmark and her puce and gasping mother, and she said, in a voice like a door closing on a crypt, "You forged a letter to break a marriage in this house, before this county, under this roof. You have finished yourself, girl. There is not a drawing-room between here and London that will receive you when this is told, and it will be told, for I mean to tell it myself. Get your mother and your hired diamonds and get out of my nephew's house, and pray God nobody remembers your face by spring." And she turned her broad brocaded back, which in that company was a sentence past all appeal, and Augusta Denmark, who had come to raise herself upon another woman's ruin, went out through the tall doors of Nethercombe weeping tears that no one any longer mistook for anything but what they were, and the county let her the way a tide lets go a drowned thing, without a hand put out. But Kelby did not stay to watch it. He was already gone. He took the great stair 3 at a time with his mother's pearls still shut in his fist, past the startled footman, up into the dim quiet of the house above where the noise of the hall fell away to nothing, and he did not need to be told her door. For there was one door in all that wing with a candle burning behind it, and he came to it and struck it once with the flat of his hand, and then, because he could not wait, opened it. She had not begun to pack. That was the thing that undid him, standing on the threshold with his breath gone ragged from the stairs, that for all her grave talk of troubling his house until morning and no longer, she had not so much as opened a box. She stood at the black window in her silver grey with her back to him and her bare throat where the pearls had been, looking out at nothing, at the frost and the dark, and she did not turn when the door opened, though she must have known his tread by now as he had come to know hers. "You should be at your ball, your grace," she said to the glass. "They will want their host to help them enjoy the ruin of me." "There is no ruin," he said. His voice came out of him rough as gravel. "It is done. The letter is exposed. An old thing of yours with a lie crept onto the end of it, and a maid bought with a crown, and Augusta gone out of my doors within the hour and out of the county's good graces for good. My aunt has seen to that. It is finished per nil. You are cleared before every soul that saw you accused." Now she did turn, slowly, and the candle showed him her face, and there was no triumph in it and no gladness, only the deep and level weariness of a woman who has already spent everything she had. "I am glad your name is safe," she said quietly. "Truly, I know what it cost you." And she turned back to the window, and he understood, with a lurch of the heart, that she thought he had come to tell her the account was settled, that the stain was scrubbed from his house. The letter answered, the duty of it discharged, and that he might now, cleared and correct, put her aside without dishonor. She thought he had come to be rid of her cleanly. She was making it easy for him. She was, God help her, being kind to him about it. He crossed the room. He did not touch her. He came and stood at her shoulder before the black glass, so that she could see his face beside her own in the dim reflection, and he made himself say the thing plainly, as she had once bidden him, where there was no music to hide behind. I did not come up here for the name, he said. Devil take the name. I came because I doubted you for the space of a single breath before all those people, and you saw me do it, and I will carry the sight of what it did to your face to my grave. I have no defense to offer you, only the shape of the wound, if you will have it. 7 years ago a woman held my heart up before all London and let the town laugh at it, and I swore I would never again put it where such a thing could be done to me twice. I built a cold house on that vow and called it wisdom, and lived in it alone, until a grey woman with an honest tongue was traded into it against both our wills, and she would not flatter me, and she would not fear me, and somewhere in the second week she pulled the whole cold house down about my ears without ever once raising her voice. That is what you have undone in me, Pernil. You have made me fit to be looked at again. And then tonight the old ruin reached up out of me at the one moment it could do the most harm, and I let you walk of my own hall away from me, 'cause I was afraid not of your falseness, I never truly believed it, but of my own heart, held up once more to the light. That is the whole of it. That is the man you married. I am asking you not to leave him in the morning. She had gone very still. In the dark glass he watched a single tear stand and fall, and she let it and did not turn. You need not fear I want the rank, she said at last, very low. I never wanted it. I have hated it, if you would know, the pearls, the county, the being looked at. I was sold once for what I was worth, Kelby, weighed out like a cargo of iron against my family's debts, and I told myself I would not be got cheaply a second time, not even by a house full of candles. So you may keep your dukedom. It was never the thing I could not bear to lose. Then what, he said, and his own voice broke on it. What was the thing? She turned. She looked up at him in the candlelight with her wary honest face and her bare throat, and she gave him at last the truth she had guarded harder than any other, the last coin in the purse. You, she said simply. Only ever you, the man who laughed in his own hall and frightened half the room with the strangeness of it. I did not want the Duke. I never once wanted the Duke. I wanted the fool who reads opposite me on wet afternoons and does not need to be told he is forgiven. Give me the title back to the crown tomorrow and turn me out with nothing but that man, and I will count myself the richest woman in England. That is the whole of my crime, and I have been trying not to commit it since the second week. He did not answer her in words. He put his 2 hands about her face, gently, as a man holds a thing he has very nearly broken and cannot believe is whole, and he bent his head and kissed her, there in the small candlelit room with the frost on the black glass, and the noise of the ball come up faint and far below. And she came up into it with a small sound that was half a sob and half his name, and her bare hands found the front of his coat and held on, and for a long while neither of them said anything at all, because there was nothing left in either of them that needed saying with the tongue. When he lifted his head at last, it was only to take the pearls from his fist. Warm still, they had never once left his hand, and to clasp them himself, with fingers that were not entirely steady, once more about her throat where they belonged. Then come down, he said low against her hair. Come down with me, not to hide it and not to answer them, and not because your name wants mending. It does not. It is my name that has wanted mending these 7 years. Come down because I mean the whole county to see, plainly and past all their sneering, whom the Duke of Nethercombe chose, and chooses, and will go on choosing until they carry him out feet first. Let them look. I am done being afraid of their looking. And so he led her back down the great stair on his arm, the grey wren they had come to shame, with his mother's pearls at her throat and her chin up and her hand warm upon his sleeve, and the hall fell silent as they came, and the fiddles stopped and 100 faces turned. He did not make them a speech. He had never in his life been a man for speeches, and he was not about to become one now. He simply drew her out into the middle of that bright floor where an hour since she had stood accused before them all, into the very place of her shaming. At the very fullest hour of the night, with every eye in the county upon her, and he took her face in his hands again, and he kissed his wife before the whole of them, slow and unhurried and entirely without shame, the way a man kisses the woman he means to keep. And he held it long past the point of any doubt, long past the first shocked rustle and the first indrawn breath, until the thing was said past all unsaying, until there was not a soul left in that hall who could ever after pretend they had not seen the Duke of Nethercombe lay his whole guarded heart down open on the floor of his own house and dare the world to laugh. Nobody laughed. The dowager Lady Pentworth by the fire brought her two old hands together in a single hard clap that cracked across the silence like a musket, and then another, and then the hall broke, not into the ugly rush of the whispering it had made an hour before, but into something warmer and more astonished. Applause and glad exclaiming, and here and there, among the older women, the frank glitter of tears, for a county that had come out on a frost night to watch a proud man's cold marriage crack open, like a nut got instead the one thing no assembly ever tires of, which is to see a hard heart break at last the right way, in the open past all its own defences. They were married again in the spring, in truth this time as they had been in name, in the little grey church at the foot of the Nethercombe Park with the daffodils out along the wall. And it was a small wedding, for the bride would have it small, and her people came up from the town, a plain warm crowd, and among them a fair young clerk named Thomas Reed, who shook the Duke's hand honestly and wished his old friend joy, and went home to his own good wife well content. So that even that last small ghost was laid to rest with a kindness. Lady Marchburn gave the wedding breakfast, and was heard to say that her nephew had at last shown some sense, which from that quarter was very nearly a sonnet. And long after, when the county had grown so used to the sight of them that it forgot there had ever been a night of frost and forgery to speak of, a certain thing was still to be seen at Nethercombe by any who called of a wet afternoon, the Duke and Duchess in the long library, reading opposite one another in an easy silence, the great cold house warm now to its farthest stone, and every little while the once feared Duke of Nethercombe would lift his eyes from his page for no reason at all, only to look at the grey-eyed woman across from him whom the whole world had once overlooked, to look at her openly, and without apology, as he had sworn upon a candlelit stare he would go on doing to the end, and she would feel the look as she always felt it, and lift her own eyes to meet it. And the two of them would sit so a moment in the firelight, saying nothing, wanting nothing, the man and the woman, and no title between them at all, and that, and not the pearls, and not the ball, and not the whole broad dukedom, was the thing he had chosen and cherished and kept.